Spring 1943. Camp Hereford, Texas. The American officer's request hung in the air of the austere administration building as Father Angelo Bartolomei struggled to comprehend what he was hearing. After 8 months as a prisoner of war, the Italian chaplain had grown accustomed to the rhythms of captivity. The daily counts, the sparse but adequate meals, the letters from home heavily censored by American intelligence. But this request was different, so unexpected that he asked Major William Peterson to repeat it. "Father, we have 200 German prisoners arriving next week," the camp commander explained patiently. "Many are Catholic. We would like you to hold Mass for them." The irony was not lost on Father Bartolomei. Captured in North Africa alongside the 10,000 Italian soldiers who surrendered at Kasserine Pass, he had been transported across the Atlantic expecting harsh treatment, possibly even religious persecution. Instead, the Americans were asking him, an enemy prisoner, to provide spiritual comfort to other enemy prisoners. "Is this some kind of propaganda?" Father Bartolomei asked cautiously in his halting English. Major Peterson shook his head. "No propaganda, Father. Just religious freedom. It's in our Constitution." This scene, recorded in Father Bartolomei's journal and later preserved in the National Archives, marked the beginning of one of the war's most remarkable religious accommodations. By spring 1943, the United States held 48 captured Italian military chaplains distributed among its rapidly expanding network of prisoner-of-war camps. These men, ordained priests who had served Mussolini's fascist forces, now found themselves called to minister in captivity, not just to their compatriots, but to German prisoners as well. The Italian Military Chaplain Corps, formally established in 1926, had deployed approximately 3,000 Catholic priests to support Italian forces during World War II. Wearing the rank of lieutenant or captain, these chaplains accompanied fighting units, conducted religious services, offered last rites to the dying, and provided spiritual counsel. Their capture alongside regular forces was consistent with their military status, though the Geneva Convention afforded them special protections. What the captured chaplains could not have anticipated was the American approach to religious freedom. The U.S. Army's policy, formalized in a February 1943 directive from the Provost Marshal General's Office, stipulated that reasonable accommodation of religious needs of prisoners of war shall be provided at all facilities. This directive, exceeding Geneva Convention requirements, reflected a core American value that extended even to enemies. The contrast with Axis treatment of captured chaplains was stark. American chaplains in German captivity reported restricted access to prisoners, confiscation of religious materials, and prohibition of services in certain camps. Reports from the International Red Cross documented that only 37% of American POWs in German camps could access regular religious services, compared to nearly 100% in American facilities. For Nazi Germany, religion represented a competing loyalty, potentially undermining ideological commitment. For America, religious freedom demonstrated democratic values in action. This philosophical divide would become increasingly apparent to the Italian priests as they observed American religious pluralism firsthand. Father Bartolomei's hesitation reflected deep uncertainty. The 42-year-old priest from Milan had served in North Africa for 14 months before his capture. His theological training at the Pontifical Gregorian University had not prepared him for the complexities of ministering across enemy lines, while himself a prisoner. His journal entry that night revealed his conflict. "The Americans asked me to be a priest first and an Italian second. Is this a trap or a testament to their values?" Camp Hereford, stretching across 750 acres of Texas Panhandle, housed approximately 3,000 Italian prisoners in spring 1943. Its 10 mess halls, recreation facilities, and administrative buildings represented standard American POW accommodation. The addition of German prisoners necessitated rapid expansion, with construction crews adding 8 barracks within days of the commander's conversation with Father Bartolomei. The practical challenges were considerable. The American garrison, numbering 250 officers and enlisted men, needed to coordinate religious services across language barriers. They requisitioned additional Catholic supplies from the Army Chaplain Corps, communion wafers, sacramental wine, prayer books in German. These logistical efforts, documented in requisition forms and supply records, demonstrated serious American commitment to religious accommodation. For Father Bartolomei and the 3 other Italian priests at Camp Hereford, the request triggered profound questions about their role. Were they collaborating with the enemy by providing religious services at American request? Or were they fulfilling their priestly vocation that transcended national boundaries? Their theological training emphasized universal Catholic identity beyond political divisions, but the reality of war complicated these principles. "I was ordained to serve all God's children," Father Bartolomei wrote in his journal. "But these Germans fought alongside us yesterday, and now we meet as fellow prisoners. The Americans who captured us both are facilitating our worship. The world has turned upside down." As the German transport trains approached Texas, Father Bartolomei prepared for his first Mass for former allies, now fellow prisoners, facilitated by their common captors. None of them yet understood how profoundly this religious accommodation would transform their understanding of democracy, or how these simple acts of worship would systematically unravel the ideological foundations of the regimes they had served. June 1943, Fort Lincoln, North Dakota. The converted Civilian Conservation Corps camp stretched across 500 acres of windswept prairie as the military truck carrying Father Lorenzo Campagna and 2 other Italian chaplains passed through the main gate. After a 347-mile journey from Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, the priests gazed at the rows of wooden barracks, each housing 50 prisoners, where 2,000 German submariners captured in the Atlantic now awaited spiritual comfort from former Axis allies they had never met. "We come as prisoners to minister to other prisoners," Father Campagna remarked to the American lieutenant escorting them. In Italy, this would be unthinkable. The transport of Italian chaplains between American prison camps represented a logistical commitment to religious accommodation that surprised the priests themselves. Army records document the movement of 26 Italian chaplains to 18 different facilities housing German prisoners during summer 1943. The American military, fighting a 2-front war requiring unprecedented resources, nonetheless allocated transportation, security personnel, and administrative support to ensure enemy prisoners could practice their faith. Camp Hereford in Texas, Camp Hearn in Texas, Fort Lincoln in North Dakota, Camp Florence in Arizona, each facility housing Germans received Italian chaplains according to documented religious needs. Military intelligence surveys from May 1943 estimated that approximately 61% of captured German troops identified as Protestant, 37% as Catholic, with the remaining 2% listing Jewish, Orthodox, or other faiths. American authorities methodically matched religious resources to this demographic reality. At Fort Lincoln, the first meeting between Father Campagna and the German prisoners revealed immediate tensions. The German naval officers, still wearing portions of their uniforms minus insignia as permitted under Geneva Conventions, stood at rigid attention when the Italian priests entered the converted recreation hall designated for religious services. "They see us as traitors," Father Campagna wrote in a letter that passed through American censors. "Italy's position grows more precarious daily, and they suspect we have accommodated ourselves too comfortably to American captivity." The political reality he referenced would soon transform their relationship. By July 1943, Allied forces had invaded Sicily. By September, Italy would surrender and join the Allied cause, changing the status of Italian prisoners in America from enemies to co-belligerents. The German POWs, watching these developments through censored news reports, directed increasing hostility toward their former allies. Against this geopolitical backdrop, American camp commanders facilitated religious services with remarkable attention to detail. Captain Robert Thornton, a Protestant from Minnesota commanding Fort Lincoln's security detail, requisitioned authentic Catholic supplies through army procurement channels. Military records show deliveries of 24 mass kits complete with chalices, patens, and liturgical vessels, 1,500 communion wafers monthly, 60 litres of sacramental wine quarterly, and prayer books in both German and Italian languages. The provision of wine proved particularly notable, as regulations prohibited alcohol in prison camps. A special directive from the Provost Marshal General's Office, dated March 12, 1943, created a religious exemption. Sacramental wine for communion purposes shall be secured and dispensed under strict supervision, solely for religious observance. This accommodation of Catholic tradition, despite security concerns, demonstrated American commitment to religious practice. International Red Cross inspections confirmed these provisions. A Swiss neutral observer visiting Fort Lincoln in August 1943 reported, "Religious accommodations exceed convention requirements. Italian chaplains conduct regular Catholic services for German prisoners with full support of American authorities, including provision of all necessary religious articles." These reports, transmitted to Berlin through diplomatic channels, contradicted Nazi propaganda about American treatment of prisoners. Father Domenico Fiorini, captured with the Italian 10th Army in Tunisia and transported to Camp Hearne, Texas, expressed surprise at American religious knowledge. The Protestant captain who manages religious affairs could discuss liturgical requirements with remarkable precision, he noted in his diary. He asked whether we preferred Gothic or Roman-style chasubles, terms I did not expect an American Protestant to know. Statistical records reveal the scale of American accommodation. By mid-1943, weekly Catholic services reached approximately 33,000 German prisoners across the camp system. American authorities allocated space, time, and resources to these services despite wartime pressures and limited personnel. The first masses revealed the power of shared faith to transcend national animosity. At Camp Florence, Arizona, Father Giulio Valentini recorded the transformation. "When I spoke the opening words, In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, I watched German faces change. They were no longer prisoners, but Catholics. They responded, Amen, with voices that carried memories of cathedrals in Munich, Cologne, and Berlin. These moments of religious unity occurred against a backdrop of increasing Allied Axis hostility as the war intensified. American bombing campaigns against German cities accelerated during summer 1943, with the devastating Hamburg raids in July killing 42,000 civilians. German propaganda depicted Americans as terror bombers destroying Christian civilization. Yet inside American prison camps, German prisoners witnessed Americans facilitating Catholic worship led by chaplains from Mussolini's army. As Father Campagna consecrated the Eucharist at Fort Lincoln that June Sunday in 1943, the familiar Latin liturgy created a sacred space transcending wartime divisions. German submarine officers who had hunted American shipping in the Atlantic now knelt alongside Italian priests captured in the North African desert, receiving communion from chalices provided by their American captors. In this moment, documented in chaplains' journals, prisoner correspondence, and military records, the foundations for a more profound transformation were being laid, one that neither the priests nor their congregants yet fully comprehended. Fall 1943. Camp Hearne, Texas. The sound of hammering echoed across the dusty compound as German prisoners, supervised by Father Antonio Ricci, transformed an ordinary barracks into something extraordinary. Working with lumber supplied by the American quartermaster, prisoners crafted a simple altar 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall. Others fashioned wooden candlesticks from scrap material. A German prisoner who had been an art student in Munich before the war carefully painted a crucifix on the wall using paints normally reserved for camp maintenance. "They work with purpose I have not seen since their capture," Father Ricci noted in his journal. "The creation of sacred space gives meaning to their days." The establishment of dedicated chapel spaces in American POW camps began as informal arrangements, corners of recreation halls or temporary use of mess facilities. By October 1943, military records show 76 permanent chapel spaces designated across the American camp system. These ranged from converted barracks to purpose-built structures accommodating 50 to 200 worshippers. The transformation of utilitarian prison spaces into places of worship required American material support and administrative approval, both provided with surprising consistency. At Camp Crossville, Tennessee, German prisoners converted a 30 by 20-foot storage building into a chapel that military inspectors described as rivaling small parish churches in its devotional atmosphere. Photographs preserved in National Archives show handcrafted pews, altar furnishings, and devotional artwork created entirely by prisoners using materials provided through official channels. The American camp commander authorized a special work detail of 8 prisoners to spend 20 hours weekly on chapel maintenance and decoration. The growing significance of these sacred spaces appeared in prison camp records tracking attendance. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, weekly Catholic Mass attendance increased from 87 participants in June 1943 to 241 by December, representing 58% of eligible Catholic prisoners. Similar patterns appeared across the camp system, documented in chaplains' reports and military intelligence assessments monitoring prisoner morale. These physical spaces required American logistical support, extending beyond mere tolerance. Transportation between camps became necessary as Italian chaplains were distributed to meet spiritual needs. Captain James Wilson, responsible for religious affairs at Fort McClellan, Alabama, recorded arranging weekly transportation for Father Paolo Vincenzo to travel 42 miles to conduct services at the satellite camp in Anniston. The expenditure of fuel and driver hours for enemy prisoner religious services raises occasional questions, Captain Wilson noted in his quarterly report, but the policy remains firm that religious accommodation takes priority. This American commitment contrasted sharply with Axis treatment of captured chaplains. Reports smuggled from German stalags indicated American chaplains faced restrictions, including prohibition of group worship in some facilities, confiscation of religious materials, and limitations on movement between prisoner compounds. A 1943 International Red Cross comparison found that while 96% of German Catholic prisoners in American camps could attend weekly Mass, only 41% of American Catholic prisoners in German camps reported regular access to religious services. The theological challenges facing Italian chaplains ministering to German prisoners intensified as news of Nazi atrocities reached American camps. Father Ricci described his inner conflict in a letter to his bishop, carefully phrased to pass through American censorship. I offer absolution to men who have participated in campaigns where terrible things occurred. Some seek forgiveness for actions they cannot name explicitly in letters. My obligation is to their souls, yet I struggle knowing what some German units have done in occupied territories. This moral complexity emerged in confession, the private sacrament where German soldiers could speak freely about wartime actions. Father Leonardo Bernardi at Camp Polk, Louisiana, wrote in his private journal, "The weight of what I hear in the confessional is sometimes unbearable. Men speak of villages emptied, of orders followed despite conscience. I represent Christ's forgiveness. But some nights I wonder if I have the authority to absolve such sins." Despite these challenges, evidence of spiritual transformation accumulated in chaplains' records and prisoner correspondence. A German officer at Camp Breckenridge, Kentucky, wrote in a censored letter home, "The Italian priest who celebrates our Mass was our enemy in Africa. Now we kneel together before something greater than nations. This experience changes how I understand the war." Christmas 1943 marked a pivotal moment in the religious life of the camps. American authorities permitted elaborate Christmas observances despite wartime restrictions, allocating additional resources for religious celebrations. At Camp Hearn, the newly constructed chapel hosted midnight Mass attended by 178 German prisoners. Father Ricci recorded the scene. The chapel glowed with candlelight, American guards stood respectfully at the doors as German voices sang Stille Nacht. For a few hours, the war seemed very distant. Military intelligence officers monitoring these services noted their psychological impact. Captain Robert Franklin, observing Christmas Mass at Fort McClellan, reported, "The emotional response among prisoners was significant. Many openly wept during familiar hymns. The religious observance clearly connected them to home and pre-war identity in ways that may facilitate eventual reintegration after conflict." These Christmas services, occurring as American and German forces clashed bitterly in Italy and prepared for the coming invasion of France, represented the paradox of American religious accommodation. As bombs fell on German cities and casualties mounted on both sides, inside American prison camps, German prisoners experienced religious freedom facilitated by their captors and administered by former allies who would soon become co-belligerents with America. The sacred spaces created in captivity were becoming catalysts for a transformation neither the American authorities nor the Italian chaplains had fully anticipated. A re-examination of the ideologies that had led these men to war, conducted through the lens of a faith that preceded and would outlast the conflict. Winter 1944. Camp Aliceville, Alabama. The unexpected sound of Ein feste Burg, Luther's A Mighty Fortress, drifted across the prison compound, mingling with the Catholic hymns from the adjacent chapel where Father Emilio Briganti conducted Mass. The Protestant service, led by Reverend Wilhelm Schmidt, a German prisoner who had been a Lutheran pastor in civilian life, represented the expanding religious accommodation within American camps. The 47-year-old Schmidt, captured in Tunisia with Rommel's Afrika Korps, now conducted weekly services for 340 Protestant prisoners with hymnals and German-language Bibles provided by the American Bible Society. "The Catholics worship there. We worship here," Schmidt told an American intelligence officer monitoring the service. In Germany, this would be permitted. In America, it is encouraged. The American policy of religious accommodation extended systematically beyond Catholic prisoners to encompass the full spectrum of religious needs. Military records from January 1944 document provision for Lutheran, Reformed, Methodist and Baptist services across the camp system, reflecting the predominantly Protestant composition of the German prisoner population. At Camp Aliceville, the 3,000 German prisoners included approximately 1,800 Protestants of various denominations, 1,100 Catholics, 35 Jews, and 65 listing other religious affiliations or none. This religious diversity required American logistical support that exceeded mere tolerance. The War Department issued Directive PW-13 in November 1943, specifying, "Religious leaders among prisoners shall be identified, verified, and permitted to conduct appropriate services for fellow prisoners. Necessary materials for worship shall be provided consistent with security requirements." This policy resulted in the identification of 122 ordained Protestant ministers among the German prisoner population by early 1944, each authorized to conduct services with American support. The accommodation of Jewish German prisoners represented particularly striking American policy. These men, German citizens who had served in the Wehrmacht, despite Nazi persecution of Jews, required special protection within prison compounds. At Camp Clarinda, Iowa, Rabbi Alexander Good, an American Army chaplain who would later die aboard the USAT Dorchester, arranged for Passover supplies to be delivered to 14 Jewish German prisoners in April 1944. The delivery included 28 boxes of matzo, haggadahs and kosher wine sent by the National Jewish Welfare Board. Military police ensured these prisoners could observe their faith safely, segregated from anti-Semitic fellow prisoners. Religious observances expanded beyond weekly services to encompass the full calendar of holy days. Easter 1944 witnessed elaborate observances across the camp system. At Fort Custer, Michigan, Father Giovanni Benelli, later to become a cardinal, conducted a 3-hour Easter vigil attended by 267 German and 189 Italian prisoners. Records indicate American authorities supplied additional candles, incense, and liturgical items specifically for this celebration. Protestant Easter services, conducted simultaneously in separate facilities, received equal support. Correspondence between prisoners and families increasingly referenced these religious experiences. Military censors, tasked with reviewing all prisoner mail, reported 43% of letters sent from Camp Breckinridge, Kentucky, in spring 1944 mentioned religious services. A German prisoner wrote to his family in Bavaria, "On Sundays, we attend church just as we did at home. The Italian priest speaks some German. The Americans provide everything needed for proper Mass. It is strange to receive such consideration from those against whom we fought." The American commitment to religious literature distribution reached remarkable levels. Quartermaster records document delivery of 50,000 German-language Bibles, 37,000 prayer books, and 62,000 religious pamphlets to prison camps between September 1943 and June 1944. The American Bible Society, working with military authorities, produced specialized editions with introductory text emphasizing biblical messages of peace and universal brotherhood, subtle counterpoints to Nazi ideology without overt political content. American military chaplains played crucial roles in facilitating these services for enemy prisoners. Chaplain Robert Mosley, assigned to Camp Wheeler, Georgia, coordinated with Father Umberto Cavalli to ensure Catholic German prisoners received appropriate sacraments. "These men are enemies of my country, but not of my faith," Chaplain Mosley wrote in his monthly report. "Our provision of religious services demonstrates American values more effectively than any propaganda lecture." This practical demonstration of religious liberty stood in stark contrast to conditions in Nazi Germany. As Italian chaplains learned about religious suppression in the Reich, the imprisonment of Pastor Martin Niemöller, the restrictions on Catholic education, the appropriation of church property, they recognized the profound philosophical divide underlying the conflict. Father Cavalli noted in correspondence later preserved in Vatican archives, "I begin to understand this is not merely a war of nations, but of fundamentally opposed views of human dignity and freedom." The Italian chaplains increasingly found themselves serving as unofficial mediators between prisoners and camp authorities. Their unique position, enemies who performed essential spiritual services with American support, gave them moral authority recognized by both prisoners and guards. At Camp McCain, Mississippi, Father Benito Romano successfully petitioned camp commanders to permit German prisoners to construct an outdoor Stations of the Cross along the interior perimeter fence, a project requiring 140 pounds of cement, 26 pounds of paint, and 14 wooden crosses, resources allocated to enemy prisoners for purely religious purposes during wartime shortages. By summer 1944, as Allied forces landed at Normandy and pushed through France, intelligence reports noted shifting attitudes among German prisoners who regularly attended religious services. Major William Davidson, responsible for monitoring prisoner morale at Fort McClellan, reported, "Regular church attendees express increasingly nuanced views of the conflict, questioning aspects of Nazi ideology that conflict with their religious beliefs." The Italian chaplains, having themselves experienced a change in status from enemy to co-belligerent, subtly reinforced the possibility of ideological transformation. This transformation remained largely unspoken, but increasingly evident as German prisoners confronted the contradiction between Nazi portrayal of Americans as godless materialists and the daily reality of American respect for religious freedom. A prisoner at Camp Hearn captured this realization in a diary later confiscated during security inspection. "They fight against us fiercely, yet ensure we can worship freely. This makes me question what I was told about America. Perhaps there are more lies I have believed." Autumn 1944. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The confessional booth in the corner of the prisoner chapel had been constructed from simple pine boards by German prisoners. yet it served the same sacred function as the ornate confessionals of European cathedrals. Inside, a German lieutenant who had commanded a machine gun company on the Eastern Front knelt as Father Salvatore Bonfiglio listened to his first confession in over 2 years. The prisoner's whispered words carried the weight of actions witnessed in Russia, decisions made under orders that now haunted his conscience. "I was told Americans would torture us," the officer confessed. "Instead, they allow me to unburden my soul and receive absolution. This makes me question everything I was told about our enemies and our cause." This scene, reconstructed from Father Bonfiglio's journal entries, illustrated the profound psychological transformation occurring within American prison camps. Religious services, initially accommodated for compliance with Geneva Conventions, had evolved into powerful catalysts for ideological reassessment. Military intelligence reports from September 1944 noted that prisoners who regularly attended religious services showed a 74% higher rate of cooperation with camp authorities and expressed skepticism toward Nazi propaganda at 3 times the rate of non-attendees. The Italian priests, now technically allied with America following Italy's surrender in September 1943, observed these transformations firsthand. Father Bonfiglio's careful documentation, maintained despite knowing American intelligence monitored his writings, recorded, "They come to confession speaking of doubts that extend beyond personal sins. They question the cause they served, the ideology they embraced." The sacred space permits contemplation impossible in barracks surrounded by die-hard party loyalists. Evidence of this transformation appeared in censored prisoner correspondence. Analysis of 7,500 letters sent from Camp Shelby between June and December 1944 revealed 1,876 references to religious services. The tone and content of these references caught the attention of intelligence officers monitoring prisoner morale. Captain James Whitfield's quarterly report highlighted the pattern. Religious references increasingly contain implicit questioning of Nazi ideology. Phrases like, "I have found clarity through prayer," and "the Church helps me see what matters," appear with growing frequency. As German prisoners experienced American religious pluralism, their understanding of religious freedom expanded. Father Marco Gianelli at Camp Polk, Louisiana, recorded conversations with German officers struggling to reconcile Nazi ideology with their renewed Catholic faith. They were taught that loyalty to the state supersedes all, including church. Here they witness a nation at war that nonetheless prioritizes freedom of worship, even for enemies. This contradiction forces reconsideration of fundamental assumptions. The priests themselves underwent transformation through their American experience. Having served under Mussolini's fascist regime, where the 1929 Lateran Treaty had established Catholicism as Italy's state religion while requiring clergy to support the fascist government, they now witnessed separation of church and state that strengthened rather than weakened religious practice. Father Gianelli's letters to his bishop in Milan, preserved in diocesan archives, revealed his evolving perspective. "I see now that the Church needs no state sponsorship to thrive. Perhaps it flourishes best when faith is freely chosen rather than imposed." Personal testimonies of spiritual transformation accumulated in chaplain's records. At Camp Herne, a 22-year-old German soldier who had been a Hitler youth leader before conscription experienced what he described as a conversion during Christmas services 1944. His letter home, partially redacted by censors but preserved in army intelligence files, stated, "The Italian priest spoke of peace on earth and goodwill toward men, while wearing the uniform of our former allies in a chapel built by our own hands, under the protection of our captors. In this moment, I recognize the futility of hate." Statistical analysis supported these anecdotal observations. Military records from December 1944 showed religious service attendance at Camp Shelby had increased to 83% of Catholic prisoners and 67% of Protestant prisoners, rates exceeding pre-war religious participation in Germany. Intelligence assessments correlated this increased attendance with measurable decreases in disciplinary incidents and pro-Nazi expressions among prisoners. Religious services evolved beyond worship into cultural exchanges. German Christmas carols, Italian Lenten traditions, and American religious practices mingled in prison camp chapels. At Camp Crossville, Tennessee, a Christmas 1944 service included Silent Night, sung in 3 languages simultaneously: German prisoners, Italian chaplains, and American guards, each in their native tongue. A German prisoner with musical training transcribed the multilingual arrangement, noting in the margin, "Different words, same melody. Perhaps nations are not so different after all." These religious gatherings became increasingly sophisticated as American authorities recognized their value in rehabilitation. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, Father Romano was permitted to establish a religious library containing 412 volumes in German and Italian. Records show 967 books checked out in a single month among a population of 1,200 prisoners. The American YMCA contributed additional religious materials, including theological works explicitly contrasting Christian teaching with Nazi racial theories. The priests who had entered captivity as fascist Italy's military chaplains emerged as unexpected ambassadors of democratic values. Father Luigi Pescamona, serving German prisoners at Fort McClellan, reflected this evolution in a sermon delivered in German and later translated for intelligence review. "We have witnessed 2 systems, one that demands total loyalty to the state above conscience, another that preserves freedom of conscience even for enemies. Christ teaches us to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. Here we see this principle honored by our captors." As 1944 ended and Allied forces pushed toward the German homeland, the spiritual transformations within prison camps acquired strategic significance. Major William Harrison, overseeing intelligence assessment at Camp Shelby, reported to the War Department, "Religious services, particularly those conducted by Italian chaplains, accomplished denazification more effectively than direct propaganda. The contradiction between experienced religious freedom and Nazi ideology creates cognitive dissonance that prisoners resolve by questioning their previous beliefs." The Italian priests, once captured as enemies, had become America's most effective ideological ambassadors, armed not with propaganda, but with communion wafers, confession, and the profound power of worship freely given and freely received. Spring 1945. Arlington Hall, Virginia. Father Angelo Bartolomei stood in his newly issued civilian clothes, the worn prisoner uniform replaced by a simple black suit and clerical collar. After 26 months in captivity, the Italian chaplain prepared for repatriation. His status changed from enemy prisoner to returning ally following Italy's 1943 surrender. On his desk lay a stack of 37 letters from German prisoners to whom he administered at Camp Hereford. Correspondence he had been permitted to maintain, despite security regulations normally prohibiting contact between prisoners and those released. "Will you continue to pray for us, Father?" wrote Corporal Heinrich Weber, a Catholic from Bavaria who had served in the Afrika Korps. "You brought Christ to us when our own country sent us to war. We will not forget." The repatriation of Italian chaplains following Italy's changed status created an unexpected legacy. Of the 48 Italian priests who had entered American captivity as enemies, 42 returned to Italy between 1944 and 1945. Military records document their systematic processing through Camp Patrick Henry, Virginia, where they received civilian documentation, modest financial compensation for prison labor, and authorization to transport personal effects, including religious materials and correspondence. 6 priests requested and received permission to remain in America until German prisoners were repatriated, continuing their ministry despite eligibility for release. The impact of their experience extended far beyond their captivity. Father Bartolomei's post-war correspondence, preserved in diocesan archives in Milan, reveals ongoing communication with former German prisoners through 1952. His letters to Corporal Weber, Lieutenant Franz Müller, and 17 other former prisoners document their religious and ideological journeys following repatriation to occupied Germany. Weber's 1947 letter describes attending his daughter's first communion in Regensburg. I explained to her that during the war, I received communion from an Italian priest while guarded by Americans. She struggled to understand how enemies could share the sacrament. Testimonies from both priests and prisoners about their shared experience accumulated in post-war interviews, memoirs, and historical studies. Heinrich Fulke, a German prisoner held at Camp Herne until 1946, provided testimony to researchers from the International Committee of the Red Cross in 1952. The Italian chaplain showed us that faith transcended the conflict. They had been our allies, became our fellow prisoners, then technically our enemies after Italy surrendered. Yet throughout, they remained our priests. This consistency amid changing political circumstances demonstrated the permanence of spiritual truth compared to political allegiances. The religious impact extended beyond individual relationships. Post-war religious participation in occupied Germany showed measurable influence from prison camp experiences. A 1948 survey conducted by American occupation authorities documented 23% higher church attendance rates among returned prisoners who reported regular religious participation during captivity compared to those who had been prisoners in Soviet camps without religious accommodation. Father Domenico Fiorini, who had served German prisoners at Camp Clinton, Mississippi, received letters from 24 former prisoners describing their roles establishing new parishes in post-war Germany. One former officer wrote, "What I witnessed in America, the separation of church and state that strengthened rather than weakened faith, guides our approach to rebuilding religious life here." American policy of religious accommodation continued into the occupation era. When US forces established governance in their occupation zone, Military Directive 27 specified comprehensive religious freedom protections exceeding Weimar-era guarantees. The American Occupation Authority allocated resources for church reconstruction, exempted religious organizations from certain restrictions, and prioritized revival of religious education. Captain Robert Thornton, who had supervised religious affairs at Fort Lincoln during the war, served as religious affairs liaison in Stuttgart during occupation, directly applying principles tested in prison camps to German reconstruction. The Italian priests who had served in American camps became unexpected advocates for democracy upon returning to Italy. Father Bartolomei delivered a series of lectures at Catholic University of Milan in 1947, drawing 200 attendees to hear his first-hand account of American religious liberty. His testimony challenged lingering fascist sympathies within the Italian church hierarchy. "I witnessed a nation at war that nonetheless ensured its enemies could worship freely. This revealed more about American values than any propaganda. Their Constitution's protection of conscience, even for adversaries, represents Christianity's influence on governance more authentically than state-established religion." Documentation from post-war interviews, academic studies, and historical archives reveals numerous cases of former prisoners entering religious vocations after the war. Records from German Catholic seminaries show 64 post-war entrants specifically citing experiences with Italian chaplains in American captivity as influencing their vocational discernment. Protestant theological academies reported similar patterns. Karl Breitner, ordained in 1951 after captivity at Camp Shelby, wrote in his seminary application, "In Mississippi, I witnessed faith transcending national boundaries when our Italian chaplain continued ministering after Italy changed sides. This demonstration of spiritual constancy amid political change called me to serve." The broader implications of religious accommodation as demonstration of democratic values became apparent as Cold War tensions emerged. American religious pluralism contrasted sharply with Soviet restrictions on religious practice in their occupation zone and prisoner camps. This contrast, experienced directly by German prisoners who had witnessed American religious accommodation, influenced public opinion in divided Germany. A 1949 survey of former POWs conducted by the University of Frankfurt found that 78% of respondents who reported positive religious experiences in American captivity expressed support for Western alignment, compared to 31% among those held in camps without religious accommodation. Father Johannes Kleffner, a German priest who had been a prisoner at Camp McCain, Mississippi, provided perhaps the most poignant reflection in a 1953 radio address commemorating the 10th anniversary of his capture. As a prisoner in America, I watched Italian priests conduct mass for German soldiers, while American guards stood respectfully nearby. Years later, I understand this tableau represented the world we were fighting against, one where faith transcended nationalism, where enemies respected each other's conscience, where spiritual freedom survived amid conflict. The Mass celebrated in American prison camps revealed the truth about which system truly protected human dignity. This unlikely wartime cooperation between American authorities, Italian chaplains, and German prisoners demonstrated what military power alone could never achieve: the transformation of hearts through respect for conscience rather than coercion. The captured Italian priests, shocked when Americans asked them to hold Mass for German prisoners, had unknowingly participated in the most effective aspect of America's wartime witness: the demonstration that religious freedom represented not weakness, as totalitarian regimes claimed, but the ultimate strength of democracy,